All right, so today we're moving on into the digestive system. So last week we talked about the respiratory system, and so you'll remember that we have two reasons to breathe. The first is to bring in oxygen, and the entire reason that we bring in the oxygen is because we need it for what? Do you remember? Yeah, we need it for energy. We need it for the production of ATP, which happens in what part of the cell? Mitochondria. And what do we call that process? Cellular respiration, right? So the entire reason we bring oxygen into our bodies is because we need it as an ingredient for cellular respiration when our mitochondria make ATP. And then, of course, we have to exhale the carbon dioxide that's produced as a waste product. Now, the other big ingredient that we need for cellular respiration is what? Not just oxygen, but we also need glucose, absolutely. So this week we're going to be talking about how we get glucose into our body. But in terms of nutrition and in terms of our need to take in things, we not only need to take in things that we can use for energy, like glucose, but we also need to take in things that we use as building blocks for making new cells, right? So we also need to take in amino acids and fatty acids, right? We need to take in those building blocks, those nutrients. All right, so the digestive system, I accidentally jumped 2 slides ahead, but that's all right. So the digestive system, you would think, oh, it's pretty easy. It's for digesting things. And it is, but it actually has more jobs than that. So certainly we're going to bring food into our body, and we're going to send waste out of our body, right? And we're going to move it through this passage. We're going to move it through the system. So movement is going to be an important function of the digestive system. But the other thing is that digestion is just one part of what we have to do. So to digest something is to break the food down into its component parts, okay? Then, once we break it into really tiny pieces and really small molecules, then we absorb it, right? So it's really not just the digestive system, it's the digestive and absorptive system. Okay? And as you'll find out, that absorption piece is super duper important. So not only do we have to break down food into smaller pieces and smaller molecules, but then we also have to absorb it and get it into our body. So those are the two things we're going to be doing. So most of the digestive system is this long muscular tube. So food goes in at the top, goes down, a little widening of the tube here, and then lots of squiggly little tube here, and then through this bigger tube, and then out. So this is sometimes called the alimentary canal, right? This is the tube through which the food travels. There are also components of the digestive system that we call accessory organs. These are organs that are not part of the tube. Food does not travel through the middle of them, right? Like your liver, or your gallbladder, or your pancreas. So we have kind of the main tube organs, and then we have these accessory organs that are off to the side. All right, so we'll start at the top. So Timmy has a terrible toothache. And he finds that what's even worse than the tooth pain itself is that he can't chew because it hurts so much, and so he can't eat his favorite foods, and he's getting really, really tired of applesauce and pudding and slurping ramen noodles, right? So we don't tend to really give our teeth credit. They're pretty darn important. So they are, of course, going to perform what we would call mechanical digestion. So the two types of digestion we're going to use to kind of frame our conversation this week is mechanical digestion, which is physically breaking down the food into smaller pieces, right? So obviously with our teeth, we take bites, we tear, we grind, we basically kind of chop the food in our mouth up into smaller bits. So that is mechanical digestion. And then there are other things that we're going to do later on that are chemical digestion, where we're actually breaking apart chemical bonds. That's different. That's chemical digestion. So the teeth are going to assist us with mechanical digestion. Pretty darn important. All right, here's Sally. And so Sally starts to develop some pain far back in her left cheek. And she notices that it hurts more and gets more swollen when she eats. So I don't know if you can kind of tell. See this swelling right back here, right? So she goes to the Student Health Center, and I meet her, and we talk about it, and I said, oh, okay, I know what this is, and the treatment for this is you have to eat Sour Patch Kids. She looks at me like I'm crazy, all right? So what's going on with Sally? Anybody have an idea? Yeah, this is coming from one of her salivary glands. All right, so salivary glands, we actually have 6 of them, 3 pairs. So we have some in our cheeks, we have some underneath our jaw, and we have some underneath our tongue. So we actually have 3 pairs of salivary glands, and they are going to produce saliva. I know, it was a surprise. That then they squirt into the mouth, right? And I had my one friend Kirby used to be able to like open her mouth and like squirt and like squirt saliva out, right? People can do that. Pretty cool. So they're going to squirt saliva out. What's happened in Sally's case is that her salivary duct is actually blocked with a little tiny stone. This can sometimes happen, right? And so then every time you eat and your salivary gland tries to make saliva and squirt it out, it's blocked, so it gets swollen and it hurts. So the treatment is to just try to salivate a bunch more to just flush out the stone, hence the Sour Patch Kids or the lemon drops or whatever. All right, this is a picture of somebody with a stone in the salivary duct or tube leading out from the gland underneath their tongue. So they've lifted their tongue up. Here's their teeth. This is the lower lip. And you can see this little kind of whitish thing there. That's just a little stone stuck in the duct and blocking the gland. So I see 1 or 2 of these a year. All right, so what's in saliva? Why is it so important? First of all, this is the first place we're going to have any actual chemical digestion because our salivary glands produce an enzyme called salivary, because it's in the saliva, amylase, A-M-Y-L-A-S-E. Amylase is an enzyme, and you'll remember enzymes are specific for specific reactions. Amylase helps us break down complex carbohydrates, starch, into simpler carbohydrates. So we are going to actually begin the chemical digestion of carbohydrates in our mouths right away. So if you ever like take a cracker or a piece of bread or something, right? So starch, complex carbohydrate. And if you can, it's not easy to do, but if you chew it up a little bit, mix it around with your saliva, and let it sit there for a while, it will start to taste sweeter because you're breaking down that starch into its component sugars, which have a sweeter taste. Right? So we actually start chemically digesting carbohydrates right from the get-go. Now, saliva has some other cool things in it too. So obviously it's watery, but it also has a little mucus in it to help make things nice and goopy and slippery, right? So that's going to aid mechanically with mixing things up, dissolving some of the stuff into smaller parts. And then the other cool thing that's present in saliva is lysozyme. Sounds like an enzyme, kind of is, but what lysozyme does is it kills bacteria. We kind of make our own little antibacterial substance in our saliva. And this is half of the reason why in the morning your breath is so bad. So at night when we're sleeping, we don't salivate very much at all, right? And so the bacterial counts inside your mouth actually increase overnight because we're not killing them with our salivary lysozyme. So that's half of the reason that we have bad breath in the morning. The other half of the reason is because we're not eating. And so we're breaking down lipids and fats for energy and producing ketones. Remember we talked about those a little bit before. All right, so salivary glands start the chemical digestion, but just of carbohydrates, just of those starches. Right? They're not going to do anything for proteins or lipids. All right, let's talk about Gina. Gina finally decides to get her tongue pierced. So excited. Had a lot of other piercings, right? So she gets her tongue pierced. That's the procedure there. And then is really surprised at how much more this hurts than her other piercings. Also the fact that they give her like this, the initial bar is like really long because the tongue gets really, really swollen, and then you have to move to like smaller and smaller ones as the swelling decreases. And she's like, this has never happened to me with any other piercing ever before. Why does this happen? Why is the tongue different than here or here? What kind of tissue is the tongue made out of? No, good thought. Any other guesses? What does it do? Besides taste, what does it do? It moves, so it is muscle. So the tongue is actually a ginormous muscle that attaches down to the floor of your mouth. This whole thing is your tongue. It's huge. You can only see the top surface of it, but it is enormous. If you've ever been to like a good deli in New York City or something and you get a beef tongue sandwich, like that's what it is, right? This is a muscle. Meat is muscle, right? So the tongue is this huge muscle. So it's really important for mechanical digestion. Next time you try eating something, try to not use your tongue at all. Just use your teeth. See how it goes, right? So we actually use our tongue a lot to manipulate the food in our mouths, to get it distributed around to our teeth, and to form it into a packet that's ready for swallowing called a bolus. This takes a lot of coordination, and if you've ever watched a baby learn how to eat, you've seen that this is not an automatic skill, right? So sometimes you put the little spoon of food in the baby's mouth, and then and then like half the food comes out the front of their mouth, right? They just don't yet have the sequence of contractions. They don't have it coordinated yet. So the tongue is one big muscle. It does have taste buds on it, and we'll come back to taste when we do the senses later in the semester. But our job in terms of digestion is the mechanical digestion that assists with and formation of that bolus or that packet of food that then we swallow as a unit. All right. Eli, remember when we used to eat like this? Someday we'll eat like this again, right? Okay, so Eli is a really social guy, and so here he is, having pizza with his friends, and he loves to talk and laugh and tell jokes. So the whole time they're eating, he's talking and laughing and telling jokes, and he keeps choking. And I think something must be wrong with me, because every time I'm hanging out with my friends and eating, I always end up choking. It doesn't happen when I'm alone. Gosh, I wonder what that could be, right? So he goes to the health center, and we're like, oh no, the problem here has to do with something called your epiglottis. So, what is an epiglottis? It is a rigid tab of cartilage that sits in the pharynx or the throat. So here's our big old tongue, that huge muscle. This is the inside of your mouth. Here's your teeth. Here's your nasal cavity, right? That nasopharynx, oropharynx. This right here is the epiglottis, and it's this little tab of cartilage. And its entire job is to direct traffic. So when you swallow, what that epiglottis does is it flips down and it covers off your voice box, your larynx, the top of your trachea, so that the food doesn't go down into your respiratory system. So every time you swallow, this thing flips down like a lid and makes sure that food doesn't get down into your respiratory system, into your trachea. Now the problem comes if you try to talk while you're eating, because in order to talk, you have to bring air out through the voice box, out through the larynx. And in order to do that, you have to open your epiglottis so that the air can come out. So that's why if you're trying to talk or you're laughing while you're eating, your epiglottis is like, wait, I'm trying to close, now you're trying to open me, now you're trying to close, now you're trying to open, right? And that's when you can choke. Okay? All right, oh, that's the same thing. This is what it looks like. So this is somebody opening their mouth really big. Here's the lower teeth, tongue. That's the uvula, that dingly down thing in the back of your throat. And this is the epiglottis, this rigid tab of cartilage. And it flops down to cover over the opening to your trachea, the larynx, when you swallow. All right, like a traffic cop. So here's another image, right? So it shows you that this is going to flip closed when the food needs to come down, right? This is what it looks like when it's closed. So that food just goes down the food tube, which is behind the air tube, right? So here's your trachea. This is the food tube, otherwise known as the esophagus. All right, any questions so far?
I have a question.
Yeah.
What do you think would happen when someone's talking, they suddenly stop talking because there's like too much saliva active flow?
Right, so sometimes if you're talking else and you're like, oh, because there's too much saliva or something, that's because your epiglottis is trying to close, because it senses something coming down.
I kind of have that feeling whenever I speak too much, I feel like I just gas up for air.
Yeah, right. You know, our bodies are like, there's a time for swallowing and there's a time for breathing and talking, and they are not the same time. Right? One or the other. All right, let's talk about Emma. She loves chocolate and tomatoes and spicy foods. And the problem is lately she's been getting this kind of pain in her chest and her upper stomach, and it feels kind of like a burning type sensation, right? So what does Emma have? What do we call that? What did you say?
GERDs.
Right? Yep. Otherwise known as heartburn, right? Because it's in the region of your chest and it feels like a burning sensation. So it's heartburn. And so the question is, what is going on? Why does heartburn happen? All right. Has to do with your esophagus. So your esophagus is just a tube. Your esophagus does not contribute to mechanical digestion, nor does it contribute to chemical digestion. It is just a transport tube. And the reason is because we have all these other things in our chest cavity, like our heart and our lungs. And so we just need to get it down into the abdominal cavity before we can do stuff with our food. We don't have room to do anything in the chest. So food comes in, here's our epiglottis, closes, so that then the food moves down the esophagus. And so it's a muscular tube that is going to do, am I going to talk about that now? No. So it's lined with a tissue that is a dear old friend of ours, stratified squamous epithelium. So remember, stratified squamous epithelium has many layers of these small flat cells, one on top of each other. And there's no blood vessels or nerves in that many layered layer of epithelium. And so it's durable and resilient, right? That's what allows me to eat potato chips and not be bleeding in my esophagus. Good stuff. All right. Yeah. So what it's going to do is a series of muscular contractions called peristalsis. And so actually, from the esophagus onward, all parts of this digestive canal, the alimentary canal, this long tube, have muscles in their wall to squeeze food through. All right. So we have an outer circular band of muscle. It's going to go like this to try to push the food that way. And then there's an outer longitudinal layer that basically scrunches up the tube a little bit. Kind of like if you're putting tights on and you scrunch them up a little bit to get your foot in, same kind of thing, a really long sock. So some of the people in the room are like, I've never worn tights, I cannot relate to that. All right, so let's see if I have, I don't think I have the video queued up. So I'm not going to stop it, but I'm going to post it in Canvas, some really cool videos where you can see peristalsis happening. So even if I am laying down, or even if I am standing on my head, or even if I am up on the space station where there's no gravity, food, once I swallow it, will move down my esophagus into the stomach. Right? Peristalsis, like squeezing a tube of toothpaste all the way down. All right. Oh, there it is. Okay. So once food gets all the way down, we want it to stay in the stomach, which is going to mix it up a bunch, and not pop back up. So we have what's called a sphincter muscle. A sphincter muscle is a circular muscle, like a purse string, that will cinch it closed. So the lower esophageal sphincter, happily named for where it is, right? It's at the lower part of the esophagus. Once the food gets down in there, it will close, therefore preventing contents from the stomach from moving back up into the esophagus as the stomach contracts and churns the food. Because the stomach not only is going to contain food, but what else does the stomach have in it that we don't want to get up into our esophagus? Yeah, acid, right? So remember, our stomachs make acid. I know we haven't talked about it yet, but you kind of already knew that, right? And we don't want that acid to come up into the esophagus, because the esophagus, although our stratified squamous epithelium is quite durable from a mechanical standpoint, it is not highly resistant to acid. It has no special protection against acid at all, unlike the stomach. Right? And the acid that our stomach makes is really strong. So this is acid reflux or heartburn, right? Where the acidic contents of the stomach, as the stomach contracts, if the lower esophageal sphincter is kind of lazy or not working properly, that acid can come up into the esophagus. And that's really, really irritating. And it can feel like a burning sensation or sometimes a dull ache, often kind of in this region right here. And the esophagus is right behind your heart, right? So you can see why it's called heartburn. This is what it looks like when somebody has bad heartburn or bad acid reflux. So we're looking down somebody's esophagus through a camera. This is normal. The pink stuff is normal. This is what normal stratified squamous epithelium looks like when you look at it with a camera. All these red spots, this is where the tissue has been burned by the stomach acid, right? So imagine like if that was your skin and these were all these scrapes or burns, right? That really hurts. That can be really painful. So that's what it looks like. All right, so what do we do when people have reflux, right? What do we do when people have acid reflux? Well, there are some foods that tend to be particularly aggravating, that tend to make this worse. So onions and peppers and tomatoes and garlic, chocolate, cola, alcohol, all tend to loosen the lower esophageal sphincter and make it lazy. So you want to avoid aggravating foods. You also want to avoid eating a lot really quickly, because then it makes it harder for that lower esophageal sphincter to stay closed when the stomach is really full. You can also try to get gravity on your side, so you can put some blocks underneath the head of your bed or have a wedge, right? So that when you lay down at night, so, you're not laying down quite so flat. And you can take things to reduce how acidic the stomach is, right? So you can take Tums or other over-the-counter antacids and avoid foods that are acidic, like citrus, coffee, cola, alcohol, and tomatoes. Okay. That's acid reflux. Questions about that? It's pretty common.
My brother actually has acid reflux. He coughs like very, very terribly. So
Yeah.
For that sort of thing.
Yeah. So sometimes if it's really severe, that acid can come all the way up and actually get into the larynx a little bit, and that can cause a cough. So just more aggressive treatment for the reflux is the recommended. Yeah, that's tough. Yeah, and sometimes in babies, that's the only way you'll know that they have this, is they'll be coughing a lot. Because they can't really tell you that their chest hurts. All right, let's talk about Stewart. So Stewart is a total caffeine addict, right? He drinks 5 to 7 cups of coffee a day, plus additional cola. And now midterms are coming. And so he starts studying extra, which means he's drinking more coffee And then he's not sleeping, and so he's drinking all this coffee and he gets headaches. So now he starts taking a lot of ibuprofen to treat his headaches, okay? So Stewart is now taking massive amounts of coffee and cola and taking very high doses of ibuprofen. And he develops a terrible stomach ache. So let's talk about what's happening with Stewart. It's a little different than Emma. So the problem here is the stomach. So what is the stomach? It's just an enlarged area of this muscular tube, right, that kind of forms this muscular bag between the esophagus, and then it's going to squirt the food out into the small intestine on the other end. Now the stomach is interesting. Instead of having just 2 layers of muscle, it has 3 layers of muscle, all oriented in different directions. So that when the stomach contracts, it can really churn the food and squeeze and squirt it around inside the stomach to really mix it up with the gastric juice or with the stomach fluids. It also has these little accordion-like folds in it called rugae, R-U-G-A-E. So those accordion-like folds called rugae allow the stomach to expand, right? So when you want to eat half a pizza, you can. Right? It might be a little uncomfortable, right? But your stomach can expand. So that's pretty cool. We have these sphincters on each end, right? So we have this lower esophageal sphincter to pinch it off from the esophagus. We also have a pyloric sphincter at the other end. So we're going to pinch both of those off so that then the stomach can contract and turn the food all up without it squirting out of the stomach. Right? And then when we're ready, we'll move the food through and open the pyloric sphincter. Oh yes, 3 different muscle layers and the rugae as we talked about. So all this churning is contributing to mechanical digestion, right? We're mixing up the food with juices, breaking it up into smaller and smaller parts. But in the stomach, we're also going to do some chemical digestion, but only of one type of molecule. And we're going to start the chemical digestion of proteins in the stomach with an enzyme that must be on the next slide. So the other thing the stomach does is it kills bacteria that are in the food that we ate. I think the next slide is more about the protein digestion. It also absorbs alcohol. All right, here we go. So mechanical digestion, kind of talked about that. Those are those 3 different muscle layers that I mentioned. And so once we mix the food up, that's now in these little pieces with their stomach juice or our gastric juices, we call it chyme, C-H-Y-M-E. You'll see that. We'll talk about the chyme moving into the intestines. All right. The chemical digestion in the stomach is by pepsin. So the salivary glands made salivary amylase. In the stomach, we have these gastric pits. There's our simple columnar epithelium. We have these little gastric pits that make pepsin. And pepsin starts the chemical digestion of proteins. Remember, proteins are multiple amino acids hooked up together. Amino acids are the subunits of proteins. So we're going to start breaking down a protein into smaller chunks of amino acids. The stomach is also where we absorb alcohol. We also absorb some in the intestines, but it starts in the stomach. And here's a little interesting trivia bit for you. Some people, most male-bodied people, unless they are of Eastern Asian descent, most male-bodied people have an enzyme in their stomachs called alcohol dehydrogenase. What does that do? So in their stomachs, alcohol, this is alcohol here, gets ethanol, right, drinking alcohol, gets broken down into its inactive form. So what this means is most, not all, male-bodied people, when they drink alcohol, a good chunk of it gets totally broken down before they even absorb it. Which is why If you take a male-bodied person and a female-bodied person, even if they are the same body size, you give them the same volume of alcohol, the female-bodied person will end up with a much higher blood alcohol level. They don't have this enzyme in their stomach. Why did it evolve that way? I have no idea. Okay, right? Some people don't have this enzyme at all, and some people, if they have literally none of this enzyme, when they drink alcohol, they'll flush and get bright red. It can be kind of exciting to see. All right, so that's one thing that's important about the stomach in terms of alcohol. The other thing is that, of course, if there is food in the stomach, the alcohol gets mixed in with the food, and that slows down the absorption of alcohol. When we talk about absorption, we're talking about it moving across into your bloodstream, right? So if that happens more slowly, right, you're less likely to get too drunk too quickly, right? So all those things about, being smart with alcohol, and they're like, don't drink on an empty stomach. This is why, right? You want to slow down the absorption of alcohol. So the stomach also has to kill bacteria. The food we eat is not sterile, right? We eat it with our hands that are covered with germs lots of the time, right? The food is not sterile, and so we want to kill any bacteria that are in it. And so our stomach makes acid. So our stomach makes hydrochloric acid. This will kill the bacteria. It has a pH of 2. It is so acidic. It is really, really strong. It will kill bacteria. It also helps activate the enzyme pepsin. So we have it for a couple of reasons. But then, of course, we need to protect our stomach from this acid, right? Poor esophagus, if it gets that acid in it, it gets burned. We don't want that to happen to our stomach. So the stomach not only makes pepsin, not only makes hydrochloric acid, it also makes mucus. So down here in those little gastric glands or gastric pits are where we make pepsin and acid. But up here we have goblet cells, which you might remember as those clear-looking cells in simple columnar epithelium that make mucus. And in the stomach, they make a really thick layer of really thick, goopy mucus that sits on top of the epithelium. So our stomach is protected by its own acid by literally a thick layer of snot that sits on the inside lining of the stomach. And so if you've ever vomited so terribly, right, the point that like your stomach's totally empty, there's no more food coming out, and then you get to the point where there's just this like yellow bile-ish kind of like stuff, and then this like goopy mucus, that's what that is. Right, you literally are like at that point vomiting up the layer of mucus on the lining of the inside of your stomach. Okay? So this mucus is super duper important in protecting us from the acid. So I've been talking a lot about all the different things that the stomach does. You might have forgotten about poor Stewart. So he was drinking a lot of coffee and a lot of cola and taking a lot of ibuprofen, and he got a stomach ache. This is why. First of all, coffee and soda are very acidic, right? So already we make acid in our stomach, and then if you drink really acidic things, right, that doesn't help. Ibuprofen, interestingly, especially if you take it at high doses for a long period of time, one of the side effects of ibuprofen is it interferes with the ability of the goblet cells to make mucus, especially in the stomach. So what happens is, see, decreased mucus production. So poor Stewart has more acid and less protection from it. Okay, so if you've ever taken ibuprofen and people have said, oh, take it with food or don't take it at really high doses for a long period of time, this is one of the reasons why. It decreases that protective mucus barrier that you have on the inside of your stomach. Questions? Yeah.
What would be the difference between ibuprofen versus Tylenol?
Good question. So ibuprofen versus Tylenol. They work in totally different ways. Tylenol will not do this to your stomach. Motrin, Advil, or ibuprofen, naproxen, which is Aleve, will also do this. So that family of medicines, so ibuprofen, naproxen, those are the only over-the-counter ones we have in this country. They will do that. Tylenol will not. The weird thing with Tylenol is we actually don't even really know how it works. We just know that it does. Okay. They've been trying to figure it out. I still don't know for sure. Okay. All right. Moving on. This is Pete. And Pete likes to party. And in a typical weekend, he'll have 20 beers a night. This is a lot. Okay? Any guesses as to the average amount of alcohol consumed by the average college student per week? How many people think it's 2 to 4? How many people think it's 5 to 10? How many people think it's 11 to 15? How many people think it's 16 or higher? So the average amount of alcohol consumed for the average American college student is 2 to 4 alcoholic beverages per week. Mm-hmm. That's average of everybody everywhere. At UW Stout, it's about 4.
Did the number used to be different back then?
Back then. These are current numbers. These are current numbers. So it's interesting, right? Because there's this idea out there that college students are drinking all the time. Some of them are, but most of them aren't, actually. So if you're kind of like Pete, you're way like off the curve, right? Way above average in terms of alcohol intake. So you might want to think about that. But sometimes you don't notice because it's like, well, my friends are drinking this much too. So you think everybody is? I know. All right. So Pete is drinking a ton. And what ends up happening is he gets stomachache too. And he thinks, oh, it's probably just like my friend Stewart. I'm drinking too much alcohol. I don't know. It's just, irritation in my stomach lining or something. So he doesn't change his behavior. And then he gets really sick and he starts vomiting. He has a fever. He has really, really severe abdominal pain. Ends up having to go to the hospital. So they do some blood tests. And they find that his lipase level in his blood is high. And so that allows them to give him a diagnosis of something called pancreatitis. And Pete has to get admitted to the hospital because this is a potentially really serious and dangerous condition. All right, so Pete gets pancreatitis. Sounds fancy, but itis just means inflammation or irritation of the pancreas. All right, so what is the pancreas anyway? It's a gland. A gland is a part of the body that makes certain substances that it then squirts into other places, right? Like salivary glands make saliva squirted into the mouth. It is located back behind the stomach. So it's really, really deep in there. It's really, really deep. It's located back behind the stomach. Sorry, my epiglottis didn't do its job. All right. The pancreas is an accessory organ. Food does not move through it. It is not part of the food tube. Here's the stomach. Here's the first part of the small intestine called the duodenum. Here's the pancreas. Food does not move through it. The pancreas, however, is going to produce enzymes and squirt them into the small intestine to help us break down the food. So the pancreas is kind of the bomb when it comes to making enzymes. The pancreas can make all the kinds of enzymes. So the pancreas makes trypsin, which helps us digest protein. It also makes its own version of amylase, remember, just like salivary amylase, but this is coming from the pancreas, to digest carbohydrates. It makes lipase for digesting lipids. And it also makes nuclease so we can break apart nucleic acids. So if you think about it, remember we talked about there's 4 classes of organic molecules? The pancreas can digest all of them, right? It makes enzymes to digest all of them. It also makes sodium bicarbonate, which is going to squirt into the duodenum to neutralize that stomach acid as the chyme comes into the small intestine, because it's really acidic from that hydrochloric acid when it's coming in. Does anybody know what sodium bicarbonate is? The common name? You have it in your, well, I don't know if you have a pantry, but back home you have it in your pantry. Baking soda, right? So sodium bicarbonate neutralizes acids, right? If you ever did the baking soda and vinegar thing, you're neutralizing the acid. So the pancreas is really, really amazing and really, really powerful because it makes all of these enzymes and then squirts them through this tube into the small intestine where the chyme from the stomach is going to be coming down. Now, our foods that we eat are made out of those 4 classes of organic molecules. The problem is our own bodies are also made out of those same 4 classes of organic molecules. So in surgery, the surgeons I worked with when I was training in medical school, the number 1 rule of abdominal surgery was don't mess with the pancreas. You just stay far away from the pancreas, right? Because if you nick a little edge of the pancreas or something, it's going to start leaking these enzymes into the abdomen that will digest your own organs, right? So inflammation of the pancreas is really dangerous. All right. The pancreas also is a total overachiever. So it not only does exocrine stuff, making enzymes that it squirts into the intestines, it also has an endocrine function. Endo means within. Endocrine means you're making a hormone that you secrete into the bloodstream. So the pancreas also makes a couple of hormones that it secretes directly into the bloodstream, including insulin. And it's going to secrete it right into, so instead of, I think I have some animations here. So instead of, the enzymes are going to go into the intestines, but hormones are going to go into the bloodstream. Insulin is one of them, which is super duper important for regulating blood sugar or blood glucose. All right. So poor Pete, right? So his digestive enzymes are leaking out of these damaged cells and onto his nearby organs. What are the major causes of pancreatitis? Well, one is really high alcohol consumption. Gallstones can do it, high cholesterol can sometimes do it, and then there's certain drugs and medications. And the thing about pancreatitis, because of these 4 enzymes that can digest and break down the very molecules that our body parts are made out of, it has a really high mortality rate. So 5 to 10%, even with the best medical care available. 5 to 10% of people with pancreatitis will die from it. Okay. So, it's scary. Right. This is what we've talked about so far. Okay? So, the teeth, the tongue, and the salivary glands, as well as the epiglottis, those are all accessories, right? They're not part of the food tube that the food moves through. And most of them just do mechanical digestion, except for saliva also has amylase to break down carbohydrates or starch. Esophagus is part of the tube, but it doesn't do any digestion, just transport. Stomach does mechanical digestion of all types of food molecules and starts chemical digestion of proteins with pepsin. And then the pancreas is kind of the bomb, right? So it's an accessory. It's just going to squirt its fluid into the food tube. But it has these 4 enzymes to break down proteins, carbs, lipids, and nucleic acids. So there's nothing that the pancreas can't make an enzyme to help break down. All right. So let's see how well you've retained that. Pull out your phones. All right. So Larry is friends with Pete, and they go out drinking together. Now, Larry is really excited because last week he got diagnosed with mono, and he's finally feeling better. So they go out and they celebrate, and they happen to drink a lot. And I think my microphone isn't working anymore. No, maybe it is. All right. So they go out drinking, and then they drink so much that then Larry's really hungover the next day, so he takes a whole bunch of Tylenol. And then over the next day or so, he notices he feels really, really lousy, like really miserable, like more miserable than he thinks he should. Then he looks in the mirror, and he realizes that he has turned yellow. So Larry goes to the health center or the hospital, where they do some blood work, and they realize that Larry actually has hepatitis. Hepatitis, oh, there's Larry's story. Hepatic means of the liver. Itis means inflammation. So hepatitis is inflammation of the liver. It could be due to an infection. So if you've heard of hepatitis A or hepatitis B or hepatitis C, those are infections caused by viruses. Or it can be due to toxins, right? Or other things. So what is the liver anyway? So it's really quite large. It's like this big. And it's this big, firm, brownish organ that lives in the upper right part of your abdomen. It receives all of the blood coming from your intestines, which we haven't talked about yet. But the blood coming from your intestines has all the goodies and all of the junk that you've absorbed from whatever you've been eating or drinking. And all of that blood is going to come to the liver first before it goes anywhere else. Okay? So the liver is super duper important. The blood vessel that brings all of that blood from the intestines is called the hepatic portal vein. The hepatic portal vein is going to bring all that intestinal blood to the liver for processing. The liver does a lot of things. Okay? Obviously, I don't want you to try to write these all down right now. We're just going to focus on these first three, and we're going to talk about them in turn. So you don't need to write these down right now. This will be to refer back to later. But I will just briefly tell you these other things. One is it helps deal with breakdown products from amino acids so that we can pee out waste products from breaking down amino acids. It also stores important things like iron and some of the vitamins A, D, E, and K. It helps regulate blood cholesterol, and it makes some really important plasma proteins like clotting factors and albumin. So the liver does a lot of really important things, but we're going to focus in on those first three. The first one is removal of waste and toxins from the blood. So that blood in your that's coming from your intestines. Your intestines are not picky. If it is a small molecule that they can absorb, they will. They don't stop and say, do I really want that molecule or do I not? No. If they can absorb it, they do, even if it's poisonous to you, right? Otherwise, it'd be impossible to poison somebody by poisoning their food, right? So whatever we eat, if we can absorb it, we do. And then it's going to come to the liver, and then the liver's going to say, oh, wait. This isn't so good. We need to break it down. Or, gosh, that's a lot of glucose all at once. Let me hold on to it. Or, gosh, that's a lot of fat all at once. Let's not let it all go into the general bloodstream. Or, gosh, that's a lot of ibuprofen or Tylenol. Let me break some of that down. Okay? So you can think of the liver as kind of a sewage treatment plant, or as kind of a quality control officer. It's going to look at everything that we have absorbed into our bloodstream from our intestines, and it's going to start metabolizing it, storing some of it for later, and detoxifying some of it as well. All right, and this is all of that just in text. So some classic toxins are acetaminophen and alcohol, which Larry had quite a bit of the last couple of days. The other thing that the liver does that's super duper important for our well-being is it manages our glucose reserves. So glucose, remember, is a simple sugar. It just has 2 carbon rings. And what we do, what the liver does, is it hooks a bunch of glucoses together. Glucose is 1 carbon ring, sorry. Hooks a bunch of them together and forms this molecule called glycogen. Right? It's basically a complex carbohydrate. Glycogen is our storage form of glucose. And then the liver stores it for us in the liver. So it's like, here comes all this glucose from what we just ate. I'm going to pack a whole bunch of it away in the pantry for later. And then when I need it, I will break it back down from glycogen into glucose to put back into the bloodstream for energy. So if you're an athlete and you've ever done carb loading the day before a big race, for example, this is what your liver was doing for you. Taking all of those carbohydrates that you ate, you broke them down into glucose, you absorbed them. Then your liver is saying, well, we don't need all this right now. So it's hooking it up, making glycogen, storing it in the liver, right? So it's putting it in the pantry so that later when you're not eating, and if you're using up a lot of glucose, right, by running or doing whatever activity you're doing, you can quickly break this down and put it out into the bloodstream. So this is what carb loading is all about, right? Maximizing the liver's ability to kind of put some glucose away for a rainy day or a moment that you're going to need a lot of it really quickly. All right, so managing glucose, super duper important. There's the test for that. The other thing that the liver is going to do that we're going to talk about in this class is it makes bile. So bile is this greenish liquid that the liver makes. And the reason why it's green is it contains something called bilirubin. Like, what is bilirubin? Bilirubin is a breakdown product of hemoglobin, right? So remember, hemoglobin is the protein in red blood cells. Our red blood cells are constantly dying. Each one only lives 90 to 120 days. That's okay because we make new ones. But when a red blood cell dies, it releases its hemoglobin. It then gets broken down into bilirubin. And then we need a way to get rid of that. So bilirubin gets put into bile along with some other important ingredients. And bile is amazing because what bile does is it allows us to emulsify fats. So have you ever tried to make cheese sauce? You're like, no, I'm not that advanced yet, culinarily, right? Or I know, you have leftover pizza and you stick it in the microwave or something and it gets really oily on top. Yeah, right? That's because oil and water don't mix, right? And so oils will separate out. So that's a problem for us because we need to dissolve stuff in water. We're water-based organisms. So in order to break down lipids, we need to get them broken apart into smaller bits that can dissolve in water. And that's what emulsification is. If you're ever making a cheese sauce, you need to put in a little bit of flour as an emulsifier. Same thing with gravy. Flour is your emulsifier, okay, that allows the lipids to mix in with the water. So the liver is going to make bile, and it secretes it and stores it in the gallbladder, which we're going to get to next. And then the cool thing about bile that I just think is really interesting is that the bilirubin, which is the green part that ends up in bile, that's why your poop is brown. If it weren't for bilirubin, your poop would be kind of like a tannish gray color. All right. So that's that information with more detail. So here's our liver receiving blood through the hepatic portal vein. It's going to process it, remove toxins. It's going to take glucose and store it as glycogen for later when we're not eating, right? And then the filtered blood then is going to leave the liver and go into the inferior vena cava, which then dumps into the right atrium. It also is going to make bile that then it's going to store in the gallbladder. So, poor Larry, his liver got inflamed because he drank a lot of alcohol, which is toxic to the liver. He had mono, which also can cause inflammation of the liver. And then he took a whole bunch of Tylenol, which in high doses is also toxic to the liver, right? So he had a kind of a triple whammy. And then his liver couldn't do its jobs, right? So the toxins weren't getting metabolized, so he feels yucky. He can't regulate his glucose well and manage those glycogen reserves, so again, he feels kind of crappy and tired. He can't make ATP. And then what's happening here is his liver isn't turning the bilirubin into bile. So the bilirubin builds up in the blood, and that's why he turns yellow. Yellow is not a normal color for your eyeballs. All right. So hepatitis can be fatal if it's severe because all of these jobs that the liver does are vitally important. You can't live without a liver. All right. Some people have chronic long-term damage to the liver. So if you've heard the term cirrhosis, those are people who have long-term damage to the liver that causes scarring and decreased functional capacity of the liver over time. So that's what cirrhosis is, kind of long-term scarring down, inflammation of the liver that decreases its functioning. Right? And if it gets severe enough, then a lot of times those people need a liver transplant to survive. All right, let's talk about Gina. I told you we'd talk about the gallbladder. So Gina was feeling fine, and then one night she went to Lucette, and she got pizza with pepperoni, sausage, and extra cheese. And then a couple of hours later, she had terrible pain in the right upper abdomen. She's like, oh no, because she's friends with Larry. She's like, oh no, maybe it's my liver. Maybe I had too many farmers' daughters and it's my liver, right? But she also notices that her eyes aren't yellow. And she also notices that her stool is this weird light gray color. That didn't happen to Larry. Okay. So she calls her mom, and her mom says, oh, it's probably your gallbladder. This happened to me, and it happened to your sister. All right. So what's the gallbladder? So here's the liver. It's huge. There's the pancreas. Here's the duodenum, the first part of the small intestine. The gallbladder is this little pouch that sits right underneath the liver. It's always shown as green because it is kind of green in real life. And the whole purpose of the gallbladder is to store bile. The job of bile is to emulsify fats. And so we don't want to secrete it into the intestine unless we need it. Because sometimes we go to Culver's and we have fried cheese curds and a double bacon cheeseburger and a concrete mixer. Sometimes we ingest a lot of lipid all at once, and we need a really big dose of bile in order to emulsify it and digest it properly. So we want the ability to store up bile for when you need a really good dose of it. So that's what the gallbladder allows us to do. Right? Oh, look, there we go. So again, this is just a close-up. So it's going to store bile, and then in response to eating a fatty meal, it's going to contract. It has muscle cells in its wall, and squirt the bile down into the intestine. And you'll see that the bile duct ends up draining into the small intestine, the duodenum, at the same place that the pancreas does. They kind of share that little window to squirt their fluid in, okay? So this way you can get a really big dose of bile in the intestine when you eat a really fatty meal. So just a reminder of what emulsification is, right? Oil and water don't mix. So if you add an emulsifier, however, then they will. Yeah. What happens if you get your gallbladder removed? Good question. Hold on to it for just a minute. I love it. Okay. All right. So poor Gina, she has stones in her gallbladder. So just like you can have stones in your salivary glands, you can have stones in your gallbladder. And what can happen is they can get stuck in the tube. They can get stuck in the duct. And then that blocks it. So then the gallbladder is trying to contract and squirt bile into the intestine, but there's a blockage there, so it hurts. And it can be really severe pain. It's often described as colicky pain, meaning it's crampy, intermittent pain. And if it's a complete blockage and you can't get any bile down into the intestines at all, you will have that change in the color of your stool, like she did. It won't be brown, it'll be that weird tan gray color. So that can feel really awful. And if somebody has this keep happening to them, sometimes then there's also risk this can get infected and it can make you really sick. So the common treatment Oh, there's just another image, sorry. So sometimes also, this is showing you sometimes the stones can be way down here, in which case the pancreas also gets blocked. So you get a double whammy. You get what's called gallstone pancreatitis. That's pretty serious. All right, so the treatment is get your gallbladder removed, okay? So if we remove somebody's gallbladder, they lose the ability to store up bile so that they have a big dose when they really need it. And instead, there's still a tube coming down from the liver. But now, as the liver makes bile, it's just a constant drip, drip, drip down into the intestines. So they've just lost that ability to save a bunch of it up. So what might happen to somebody who's had their gallbladder out if they go to Logjam and get fried cheese curds on a double bacon cheeseburger? Are they going to be able to digest it well? No. Okay? So most people who've had their gallbladder out do absolutely fine unless they eat a really high-fat meal. If you eat a really high-fat meal and you just don't have enough bile to help emulsify those fats, and you can't digest those fats, you get abdominal cramping and diarrhea. Usually the answer when you can't digest something well is diarrhea. Usually that's what happens. Okay? But it'll be kind of greasy diarrhea and fatty diarrhea because there's fats that you can't break down and absorb. So most people do just fine with their gallbladder out and much better than when they had gallstones. But it does mean that, you know, they shouldn't get into like a bacon eating contest. Okay. Other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
If you get your gallbladder removed, is there like a transplant?
Nope, no transplant. So let's talk about transplant for a second because it's actually really interesting. So say I have really bad liver disease, right? For whatever reason. Can't live without a liver, can live without a gallbladder. That's the difference. And so I need a transplant. Where does that come from? Another person, right? Is another person going to have exactly the same antigens on their cells that I have on my cells? Right, not. We're going to try to find as close to a match as we can. So if you've ever learned about donor registries and seeing if somebody is a match, that's what they're looking at. They're looking at the antigens on the surfaces of the cells and seeing if they are the same. So remember, our immune system looks at self versus non-self. So if it's all the same kind of antigens, then it's a match, and you should do okay. But so a transplant surgery is a big deal, right? Unhooking an organ from all of its connections and blood vessels and nerves, removing it, and then replacing it with another one that somebody happened to be able to donate because they died and were otherwise healthy, right? So it was a healthy organ. And you have to do it with a certain amount of time, right, before that organ dies. And then the other thing is you're at risk of what's called rejection, right? So we have the ability to look at a lot of the common antigens and see if it's pretty much a match, if your body will go, oh yeah, that's self, right? Recognize those antigens. But we're not perfect at it, right? And sometimes you don't have a totally perfect match. So we want to avoid the recipient, the person who gets the donor organ. We want to avoid their immune system attacking the donated organ. So everybody, pretty much, who receives a transplant is on medicines to suppress their immune system so that they don't reject that transplanted organ. Right? So you can imagine then, if you're on medicines that suppress your immune system, that makes you more vulnerable to infections and other things. Right? So those are some of the classes of people that we worry about with COVID or with lots of other types of infectious diseases. You might think, oh, I don't know anybody who's had a transplant. You do. You just might not know that they've had one. But we've had students who've had kidney transplants, who've had liver transplants, who've had heart transplants. So, yeah. Good question. So, yeah, a gallbladder would just not be worth it in the risk-benefit ratio. You can live without one. So it's not worth a surgery to get a new one harvested and placed in, and it's not worth going on drugs to suppress your immune system because they can be dangerous. Other questions? Yeah. COVID update. Yes. Let me show you where we're at.